Good evening, I'm your host Emma, and you're listening to the True Crime Witch podcast, the podcast that takes you into everything murderous, mysterious, and downright macabre. Now, today I'm bringing you not one, not two, but 3 identified Doe cases. The only sort of housekeeping I have at the top of the episode is I've opened my own Etsy store. It's just called Sword and Roses. So if you go on Etsy, search for Sword and Roses, or go on my Twitter, I'm sure I've tweeted plenty of links. But without any further ado, let's get into it. There are a few details about our first case, but I felt like I wanted to include it nonetheless. On November 5th, 1980, the skeletal remains of a young woman and her dog were discovered in a wooded area in Rapides Parish, Louisiana. A man came forward and told investigators that he had shot the dog, but had no idea that the woman was in the same area. Sheriff William Earl Hilton told Town Talk, quote, "A man was rabbit hunting with his beagles when one of the dogs began baying. The hunter initially thought the rabbit had grabbed the dog's attention. He went over there and found a human skull. All that was found with the Rapides Parish Jane Doe were a pair of grey socks either made from wool or cotton, but some articles have listed these as being gloves. The only things that investigators knew was that she was between 5 foot, 5'5", with possible shoulder-length brown hair. She was anywhere between the ages of 15 and 19 and had fillings in her teeth which had been well looked after. There is one more detail I was able to find about the Rapides Parish Jane Doe from her Doe network profile. This detail includes a lot of medical terminology, so please forgive me if I mess this up. I am not clinically trained. Her Doe network profile says the following under distinguishing marks/features. Unfused metopic suture, fibrous joint, cranial suture between adjacent developing bones of the skull. This suture begins at the nose and runs superiorly to the sagittal suture and fuses in early childhood before all other cranial sutures. At the time of her discovery, the Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office weren't able to determine a date or cause of death. It appears that the Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office were not well versed in dealing with cases such as this, and didn't know to involve a forensic anthropologist. With vital pieces of information missing, the case sat cold. Rapides Parish Jane Doe was buried without so much as a name or a date of birth to adorn her headstone. The case of the Rapides Parish Jane Doe would lay dormant for decades. That was until the Louisiana State University Repository for Missing and Unidentified Persons joined the investigation. They created a reconstruction of the Rapides Parish Jane Doe and with the help of local news outlets circulated this throughout the state. A quote from KSLA article written in August of 2019 says the following. The repository was able to establish the victim was a Caucasian female between the ages of 16 and 21 at the time of her death. It was believed the victim's remains were exposed to the elements for approximately 2 months up to a year. The repository also assisted the documentation of the victim's DNA profile. With this new reconstruction circulating the airwaves and throughout social media, an elderly woman contacted the Rapides County Sheriff's Office claiming that the doe found in 1980 could in fact be her granddaughter. She said that she had seen the photo on NCMEC's Help ID Me Facebook page. As the repository had collected her DNA, the sheriff's office took a sample. And boom, it was a match. The Rapides Parish Jane Doe was formally identified as 18-year-old Donna Gail Brazel. Police now believe that Donna was the victim of a kidnapping, rape, and murder before her remains were dumped in the woods. Now, not only do we have an identification of our doe, but we also have an arrest. Well, actually, it's not just one arrest. We have 2. 64-year-old Leo Laird and 54-year-old Gary Joseph Heyman have both been charged in connection with Donna's murder. Leo Laird is currently being held on a $1 million bond for first-degree rape and aggravated kidnapping. As of yet, no charges or bond have been filed in relation to her murder, but it is a work in progress. Gary Heyman is actually already in prison, serving 49 years for second-degree kidnapping, first-degree robbery, and public bribery. The Rapides County Sheriff's Office have said that they are still working on additional charges towards both the men, but have not said what evidence that they have against either of them. The case against Laird and Heyman is a work in progress, and with the world being upside down right now, it might take a little longer than usual to see justice served. The Rapides Parish County Sheriff's Office are being very tight-lipped about this investigation, but as always, if there are any updates, I will be the first to let you know. Case number 2. On March 7th, 2015, 13-year-old Parker Wilhelm, accompanied by a group of his friends, were playing in the woods off Tylersville Road in Westchester, Butler County, Ohio. In his account to police and later the WCPO Cincinnati News, he said that he couldn't remember whether he tripped over the body or the debris nearby. Wilhelm explained that him and his friends thought it was some sort of disregarded Halloween decoration until the smell hit them. The smell of decomposition is one that you'll never forget, and moments after they made the horrifying realization, they called the police. Wilhelm added, quote, "This was natural life, an actual person. She had friends and family. It stuck with me for a while, and it still does," end quote. Further searches of the area revealed the rest of the Doe's remains, and the pathologist was able to determine that the skeleton belonged to a white female. Due to them being skeletal remains, a forensic pathologist was called in to further investigate. According to her DNA Doe project page, the anthropologist estimated that the Jane Doe was anywhere from 35 to 60 years old, around 5'6", and due to the condition of her remains, a weight estimate was not possible. The page also mentions that she had pregnancy scars, but I'm unsure of how this was determined if her remains were skeletal. Nonetheless, it was determined that she had given birth at least once in her life. Her hair was described as brown, but with greying streaks between 6 and 12 inches long, which is around chin length, and she had added layers. She had extensive dental work with unique dental implants, but these sadly didn't lead investigators to her identity. Lisa Mannix, who is the Westchester Police County Coroner, told WCPO Cincinnati News, quote, "We have surveyed over 260 dentists throughout the nation to say, hey, do you think that you might have put these implants in someone who looks like the artist's rendition? That brought back no leads," end quote. Investigators also found some personal items near the skeletal remains, which were a white pullover with red and blue stripes, SAS black shoes, which are commonly popular with people who do a lot of work outdoors, a blouse, faded glory blue jeans, glasses, and a bum bag that contained lip balm and a lighter from a bull riding event. With nothing much else to go on, an estimation drawing was created and circulated around the Westchester area. She was buried without a name, without a date of birth, and nobody to attend her funeral and arrange the service. Her DNA was entered into the system, but showed no hits. She had never been arrested, at least never for a serious crime that would require a DNA sample. And it also appears that she had never worked for any government agency. It's my understanding, and obviously please correct me if I'm wrong, that government workers and possibly even military personnel provide some sort of fingerprint and DNA samples upon joining. Please let me know on that one. I always thought that was the case, but perhaps I'm just wrong. The case lay dormant until October of 2018, when who else but the DNA Doe Project stepped in to help. I cannot speak highly enough of the DNA Doe Project, and if you are able to, go and make a general donation to them if there is a case that they are working on that needs funds. go and donate to them. They have some wonderful merch. I actually have a DNA Doe Project phone case. It's very near and dear to my heart. And in the future, I would love to work for the DNA Doe Project. So go and familiarise yourself with them because they do some incredible work. Through the use of a wonderful technique called forensic genealogy, a presumptive match was found which led them to possible family members. Once the Westchester Police and the DNA Doe Project tracked down these family members, they showed them the estimation drawings and the extensive dental work. In 2019, a press conference was held by the Westchester Police Department as they announced the news that everyone had been waiting for. The Westchester Police formally identified the Westchester Jane Doe as 61-year-old Darlene Wilson Norcross. As of 2020, there's still not a whole lot of detail about Darlene, but here's what we do know. We know that she had lived on the East Coast but moved to Westchester after a divorce. It's said that she had no children, although her post-mortem examination suggests differently. Darlene appears to have been estranged from her family and friends, was self-employed, and her contact to the outside world was extremely minimal. And because of this, she was never reported missing, none of her details were filed. If no one knows you're missing, they can't report you missing. Dr. Elizabeth Murray told WCPO News, quote, "This case in particular reminds us that people can become so isolated, and it is important to stay in touch with relatives and stay in touch with friends, to look after each other." End quote. Darlene's family were notified before the press conference, but wished to not appear at the conference. They instead issued the following statement and asked for privacy. After years of various efforts by various agencies, Darlene Norcross has been reunited with her family. We would like to thank the Butler County Coroner's Office and the Westchester Police Department for their tireless and valuable work in bringing closure to our family. Without them, this day would not have come. The fight for Darlene is far from over, however. Her cause of death is still unidentified, and as far as I can find, there's no PMI either. It's estimated that her body had been in the woods for around a year before her discovery, but there's no further information. That also brings up the identity of her killer or killers. We have no information about who they could be either. Westchester Police are now appealing to anyone with information about Darlene's case to please contact them on 513-777-2231, or you can email the Butler County Coroner's Office at coronerstips@butlercountyohio.org. Remember, no piece of information is too small or insignificant and could be the missing link towards justice. I now bring you our third and final case. A desolate oil field located in Galveston County, Texas, has been given the disturbing name of the Killing Fields. Between 1983 and 1991, the bodies of 4 women were found dumped after they had been viciously murdered. I have already talked about the tragic story of Janet Doe, who has now been formally identified as Donna Prudhomme, but I want to talk about another victim of the Texas Killing Fields who, up until 2019, was also only known as Jane Doe. On February 2nd, 1986, 2 teenagers were riding their bikes in what we have come to know as the Texas Killing Fields, located off Irvin Street and Calder Road. The boys discovered remains of not 1, but 2 females and called it in to the police. Police were only able to identify one of the victims through the use of dental records, and she was identified as Laura Miller. However, the other victim laid unidentified and was simply known to the Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office as Jane Doe. It was determined that Jane Doe had been shot in the back of the head and had a few broken ribs. Police were able to collect business cards, keys, shoes, and hair, but that was about it. There wasn't much else at the crime scene. In an article written by ABC 13, police described it as being hard to tell what was evidence and what was trash. With nothing else to go on, police seemed to be at a dead end. No one had come forward to claim Jane Doe despite the media circus that had surrounded hers and Laura Miller's discovery. She was laid to rest in a grave marked Jane Doe. That was until 2016, when the League City Police Department reached out to who else but Parabon Nanolabs and asked them for their help. A DNA sample was taken, and Parabon were able to create an estimation of what Jane Doe had looked like in life. Not only did they use her DNA to create a phenotype snapshot, they also ran the DNA through a genealogy website, which for the time was pretty groundbreaking stuff. Whilst police worked their way through Texas and Memphis showing their phenotype photo to locals, the League City Police Department received a very important phone call. It may have taken 3 years, but the genealogy website had found a match. They had found a first cousin of their Jane Doe. Another tip to identify her came when a woman called Shirley Love, who claimed to be the Doe's auntie from Memphis, Tennessee, called the League City Police Department. She told ABC 13 News, quote, "I just knew it. I just knew that it was her. The more I read it, it was like chills just went from the top of my head to my toes." End quote. After Parabon Nanolabs and the police worked alongside Shirley Love, a press conference was held and Jane Doe was formally identified as Audrey Lee Cook. Audrey Lee Cook was born on November 25, 1955 in Memphis, Tennessee. Not a whole lot of information is known about Audrey, and her family have asked for privacy whilst they deal with her death. In 1976, she moved to Houston, Texas, and was living with a roommate and her new kitten, Caesar, that she absolutely doted over. Even though her family were all the way in Tennessee, they kept in frequent contact, and her and her mother would write letters to each other almost every week. They continued to fall through the letterbox of the Cook home every few weeks until Christmas of 1985. Without warning, the letters stopped, and Audrey simply vanished. A family member told ABC 13, quote, "She was enjoying life. Then someone took that joy from her. They took her from us." End quote. Now, remember how I mentioned that her Auntie Shirley Love called the League City Police Department in 2019? Well, it turns out that Shirley has been looking for Audrey ever since she went missing in 1985. At first, her family had thought that Audrey had just gone off to do her own thing. She was known to be quite free-spirited and, do what she wants. But as the years crept by, it seemed more and more unlikely that that was the case. Shirley told ABC 13, "In the 33 years that I have looked for her, there was probably never a 6-month period of time that I was not doing something. My personality is not one to give up." After identifying Audrey, the detectives from the League City Police Department were able to reunite her family with her remains. Her mother passed away, not knowing what happened to her daughter, but her Auntie Shirley was still alive and waiting desperately for answers. Detective Gina Vogel flew out to Memphis personally to give Audrey's remains to Shirley, who said, "When she handed me her remains in the parking lot at the funeral home, all I could do was just hold them and think that she was finally home. To put her to rest beside her mother. It isn't what I wanted, but it was part of closure." The League City Police Department are now appealing to anyone with information about the murder of Audrey Lee Cook or her whereabouts in the months leading up to her death. It's known that Audrey had recently become involved with drugs and started mixing with the wrong people, but that does not make her any less deserving of justice, nor does it excuse what happened to her. Detective Gina Vogel, who had been involved in the identification and most of the recent investigation into Audrey's death, said about her being involved with drugs and the wrong people, quote, "Still, nobody deserves to be left in a field. Nobody deserves to be killed, and nobody deserves to be mangled like that. I have daughters, and I can't imagine what her parents went through not knowing. I think that's probably the worst thing, not knowing. If you have any information about the murder of Audrey Lee Cook, you are urged to contact the Cold Case Unit at the League City Police Department on 281-338-8220. Thank you for giving these 3 cases a moment of your day. Hopefully the right person comes forward and we get some more information about these and we have some convictions. I do like having Doe cases where the Doe is identified, but it's even sweeter when we have a suspect or even someone in custody like our first case. So, that was this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed. As always, you can find me on all of the different platforms. Just search for True Crime Witch. I'm available on Patreon. Patreon listeners, you'll be hearing this a day early. If you want to get early access, stickers, and exclusive content, you can just do an old Google True Crime Witch Patreon. It will come up. And yeah, be excellent. Look after one another because the world's a bit upside down at the moment. But most importantly, remember friends, stay safe and stay spooky.